excited about what I'm going to be speaking on tonight. This is, one of my favorite subjects because of the way God gave it to me. I can remember the fears that I lived in years ago when, I was young. I was just in my 20s. I feared that I might lose a member of my family. I was always concerned that maybe one of them would get some weird disease or maybe be in a horrible accident. And I remember praying, Lord, is there any way to be protected from all the evils we see coming on the earth? Is there any way, is that possible, or do we just develop a que sera, sera attitude? Lord, whatever's going to happen is just going to happen. Well, I wasn't praying in faith. I was simply mouthing words to God. But I remember lying back across the bed, and I had a dream. It only lasted 5 minutes, and so I woke up very quickly. But in that 5 minutes, God supernaturally gave me a dream, and it totally changed my life. I was out in this open field asking the same question that I had prayed earlier. And I was saying, Lord, is there any way to be protected from all the things we see coming on the earth? I mean, there were so many diseases, so many accidents. And I was saying, God, is there any way? And in the dream, God quoted a verse to me out of Psalm 91. In your day of trouble, call on me and I will answer. Now that was before I even knew that Psalm 91 existed. But the ecstatic joy that I felt that day, I tell you what, it was beyond anything that I could even possibly describe to you. I thought my heart literally was going to burst when I heard those words. So I knew it was supernatural. And suddenly, to my surprise, in the dream, the field began filling up with hundreds and hundreds of people. I watched as more and more people were added in every direction. And we were all out there just thanking God and praising Him for the answer. Well, when I woke up, I knew I had my answer. It was like peace, like warm oil, just poured all over my body. I didn't know quite what the answer was, but I knew that God had spoken to me. Now, it wasn't until the next day that God supernaturally spoke the words to me, Psalm 91. Now, I'd never heard of that psalm before. I didn't even know it existed. In fact, I didn't even know that there were 91 psalms in the Bible, But I knew that dream was supernatural. And I knew that whatever was in that psalm was an answer from God. And I tell you what, you should have seen me. I grabbed my Bible and I nearly tore the pages turning to see what it had to say. And God spoke to me that this was a supernatural protection covenant for the end days, that it was especially for the end days, but that it was conditional. Well, now God showed me that these promises were only for the ones who would choose to dwell in the shelter of the Most High. It was for the ones who would say, God, I want to abide in your shadow. I want to hear your voice. And I tell you what, you should have seen me when I realized that there were answers in Psalm 91 for all the questions that I'd been asking. It was kind of like I thought, oh, Lord, every question I've been asking, everything I've been fearing, answers are right here in this word. And I realized that all the events leading up to getting me to Psalm 91 were just as miraculous. When I realized that, I nearly had to run away. I mean, I was in my bedroom by myself, and I was running and jumping and clapping. And I want you to know that this psalm can literally change your life. And that's why this message is so important. Now, I'm going to go straight through the psalm. I'm going to be using the New American Standard Bible. In verse 1, it says, He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide under the shadow of the Almighty. In other words, the shadow of the Almighty will be over us, covering us. Have you ever been inside a house with a big fire going on in the fireplace, and boy, you just felt all cozy and dry while you watched this huge electrical storm going on outside? But you just felt so good because you could feel that warm feeling because you knew that you were being sheltered from that storm. And it didn't matter how much it raged on outside. You watched it and you were totally at peace because you knew you were out of reach and you knew you were safe. Okay, that's exactly what this psalm is all about. Did you know that there is a place in God? And I really want you to hear this today. There is a place in God. It's a secret place for God's children who want to seek refuge in Him. Now, not every Christian's going to look for it or even think about it. But if you want it and you reach out to God, there is a place that He has, especially for you. And I can't even begin to tell you how wonderful it can be. And it's an actual place now of physical safety. I'm not just talking about spiritual safety. That's there, of course. But there's physical safety that God is telling us about in this psalm now. And this secret place now, it's literal, it's real, but it's also conditional. And here in verse 1 now, God lists out our part of the condition before he even mentions his part. And this is because our part has to come first. Remember that. Your part has to come first. In order to abide now under the shadow of the Almighty, we have to choose, Lord, I want to dwell in your shelter. I choose to dwell in your shelter. Now, the question that I was asking was, how do I dwell in the shelter of the Most High? That sounds good, but how do I do it? I had no idea. You may utterly believe that God is your refuge. You may have given mental assent to it. You may have even prayed it and said that, but really didn't know what it meant. But unless you actually get up and run to that secret place spiritually, you're never going to experience it. It's not enough to just want it or believe for it. You've got to get up and literally, spiritually go to that secret place. Now, we dwell in his shelter by believing that he is a literal place of refuge. And that's one of the things he spoke to me that day. He said, I'm a literal place of refuge for me. And by believing that his word is true, we can be physically protected when we decide that we're going to run to God and we're going to stay under that protection. And I remember that day as God was speaking to me, I was just bouncing all over the place. I was so excited. Now, this place of refuge, I like to say that it's a love walk because that's how God spoke it to me. He said, this is a love walk that I want to have with my children because it's a relationship with the Father where he literally becomes your very best friend. Where you drive down the road, you're off in the car by yourself, and you realize that he's right there in the car with you. Wherever you are, you know he's right there with you. He never leaves you, and he never forsakes you. Now, some days, some people don't have that kind of relationship with the Lord. And I've had them ask me, well, I don't have that kind of relationship. I don't know what to do. But I had to tell them, I didn't have that kind of relationship either. But all is God is telling us, if you want it, you can have it. Just come to me and ask for it. And so the Lord told me, just start welcoming me. Just start telling me, Lord, I want this kind of relationship. I welcome you into my life. I try to do that every morning. I take a walk. I think I got this when I was back in my 20s. And, of course, I'm 84 now, so I've been doing it for a long, long time. But I walk every day just telling the Lord how much I love him. And he speaks it back to me, how much he loves me. We don't know what we're going to be faced with each day. So it's so very important to get in our secret place as soon as we get up each morning. I used to have my Bible study sometime later in the day, but now I try to have it as soon as I can in the morning because I want to start off my day holding hands with the Lord and having this love walk with him. Now, I have a personal friend from my hometown. Her name's Mary Johnson, and she told me her story in her own words. She said, we live 12 miles out in the country. So she said, I was surprised when I was interrupted by two men who came in a van, and they were asking for a drink of water. But she said the pretense was over when one of them pulled a gun and told me to get in the van. Well, she said, they told me that they wanted to reach my husband, and they were going to ask for some ransom money. Now, athletic tape was put over her mouth and over her eyes, and Mary said that it was frightening because she thought, what on earth is fixing to happen? But she said suddenly she remembered her Psalm 91 covenant, and she said, I stopped and I just said, Lord, I determined I'm gonna be with you. I'm gonna stay with you. You're not gonna leave me. Now, the men were able to pull her out of the house, but they were not able to pull her out of her secret place. She said, my secret place was locked in. And she said wherever she went, Psalm 91 was always there in the background. She said that the enemy tried to remind her that she was soon going to be 50. She was soon going to be a grandmother. And the enemy says, you're not going to be able to enjoy either one of those. And she said, whoa. She stomped her foot and she said, no, I have a covenant with God. And so she instantly started reminding the Lord of her covenant. Now, she was forced over a barbed wire fence, and they took her across a pasture to this old abandoned house, and she was handcuffed to the bathroom sink. And they said that if her husband tried to turn them in or did anything like that, they said, he'll never see you again alive. And then they drove off and left her there in the house. Now, she said that she kept quoting her promises. She kept quoting Psalm 91 and thanking him that he was with her and that he would never leave her and he would never forsake her. And so she immediately started trying to get the pipes loose because she was tied to the pipes in that sink. But she said they wouldn't even budge. She said God then reminded her of the promise in Psalm 91, verse 15. He said, in your day of trouble, call on me and I will answer. So she said immediately when that came back to her, she started saying, Lord, I am calling on you. I need you. I need you right now. And then she said for the first time, she noticed a tiny little pipe coming up the back of the sink. And she said she didn't have any idea how she was able to break through it. And she said she knew it was a miracle because later when the FBI guy was talking to her, he said, I have no idea how you broke that pipe. He said, it looks to me like there would have been no way. But she said she knew it was the Lord. Well, she said then when she got it broken, she was out the back door and over the fence in no time. Well, after walking several miles, she was unsure of where she was because she had been blindfolded. But she found a house. No one was there, but the door was unlocked. She found out later that they never left their doors unlocked, but the door was unlocked. And after several calls, the sheriff then was on his way. Now, the kidnappers skipped the first scheduled meeting, and they called for a new appointed time. They said they would meet her husband in Austin, Texas. She said that obviously now the kidnappers didn't know that she had escaped. So by this time, it was the Texas Rangers now who met the men there, and I'm sure they were quite shocked. But it's imperative that we remember that our only real protection is staying in the secret place. We can have all kinds of people around us trying to help us, all kinds of things going on, but the only real protection, and the Lord kept telling me this, he said, I am your real protection. No matter what else you have or what else you don't have, he said, remember, I'm always there. Now, the moment we begin relying in the natural, what it does, it gives the enemy it gives the enemy an open door if we're not relying on the Lord. But the moment we start relying on the Lord, it starts closing the door to the enemy. And that's why the enemy tries so hard to get us into fear. Fear is one of our worst enemies. That was one of the first things that the enemy put on Adam and Eve was fear. And if you have fear in your life, it's worth anything it takes for you to stop and say, Lord, I believe your Psalm 91 protection, but this fear is a real enemy, and do whatever God tells you to do to get that fear out of your life. It may be quoting your Psalm 91 promise. It may be quoting other promises that he's given you, but get rid of the fear. That's your worst enemy. And I was so full of fear. And so it was so wonderful to come to a place where I said, Lord, it feels so good not to have fear. And fear's going to come occasionally, of course, but stop right then. Don't do anything else until you get that fear off your life. Now, the man who was convicted of this crime, he was no amateur criminal. According to the police now, he had a habitual crime problem, and it had been there since his youth. And he had been imprisoned before for robbery, for indecency, for sexual assault. And for the present offense now, they put him in prison for 99 years. That's how bad it was. And the sheriff told Mary that they had never had anyone in their local jail as malicious as this man was. And so she had no idea until then how really bad it was, what she was facing. But the FBI was shocked that Mary had escaped, and they were even more shocked than that she had not been beaten, raped, or murdered. They just kept telling her, we don't understand this. And she said, I understand it. I have the God of the universe with me. Now, yes, the Lord is so good. There are few people who understand the power that's in this wonderful covenant promise. So make it a top priority in your life. You'll never be disappointed. Now, Dale Hicks is another strong Psalm 91 miracle. Dale was a boat captain now who sailed along the Florida coast. And on this particular day, he was flying home from a friend's funeral, and there were 3 other passengers in the plane. Well, when the plane just suddenly, he said it just dropped out of the sky. They had no idea what happened. Well, the plane floated just long enough for them to get out of the plane before it sank. But miraculously now, there was an expert swimmer These things are not by accidents. When we're believing God, he just happened to have an expert swimmer, and he dived down 20 feet deep where the plane had lodged, and he was able to bring up life vests. Now, imagine being able to dive down 20 feet, get the life vest, get his wetsuit, and a 10-foot canvas tarp and a rope, and he tied that to the plane down under the ocean. And then he tied each person up on top with a rope to keep them from being washed away in the tide. And the water, they said that day, was 55 degrees. But for God to have someone right there that did all of that, I mean, that's not normal. That's miraculous. That's what God does for us when we're trusting him. Now, Dale said that he could never remember in all of his life being that cold and that tired. Well, sadly, they had an attorney and his wife. They were two of the passengers, and they tried to keep holding them up, but before it was over, both of them, they did drown. But Captain Dale and his wife, Pat, now, they had for months been quoting Psalm 91 promises, and it finally became obvious, he said, why God then had impressed him to memorize Psalm 91. He said he had always just read it out of his Bible, and he thought that was good enough. But not long before this trip, God had told him, I want you to memorize it. And he said all of a sudden he realized why he needed it memorized when he's out there in the middle of the ocean. Well, by now, his wife, Pat, back home, she knew that something was wrong. Something was desperately wrong. And she said that this was her time then to put her faith to work. And she said all kinds of vain imaginations were coming, but she said, I don't care what the enemy's throwing at me. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care what it sounds like. Lord, I'm going to put my trust in your Psalm 91 covenant. Now, I want you to take note that this is so important to refuse every tormenting picture, every thought that the enemy puts. Because I promise you, when you're in a situation like that, you're going to have a lot of tormenting thoughts. You're going to have a lot of unfaith pictures that start flashing in your mind. And so she said, Lord, I don't care what it looks like. I'm trusting you. Well, the Coast Guard said it was their biggest search in Florida's history. And there were 16 private planes and a lot of boats, they said, involved in this huge search and rescue. And Pat just continued to pour over her Psalm 91. She said that she said it over and over and over, holding on faithfully to those promises. And I want you to listen to what happened. The expert swimmer, miraculously, had finally been able to swim to shore. He got them all settled, he got them all tied down, and he swam to shore. And they said that they felt like it would have been an impossibility for someone to swim to shore. But God gave him the strength, and he made it. And Dale was unconscious now, so when the rescuers started flying over, they were looking for them. And they saw him, but he had passed out, so they thought, okay, he's dead. We'll go on and check for somebody else. But in spite of Dale being completely unconscious, just as they were preparing to pass him by, and remember, he's unconscious, but he suddenly just lifts one of his hands. You know that's God. I mean, think about that. Another miracle, his church had felt the need to pray fervently that they'd be protected from sharks. And when he was finally rescued, unconscious, there were no sharks anywhere around him. But the others, they said, had been swimming as hard as they could swim, trying to keep away from the sharks. And the sharks, they were tied to the plane, but still the sharks were coming and they were having to swim. They said it was a circus. Now, there's so much to learn from Pat. She faithfully used her authority, and she absolutely refused to say, let one word come out of her mouth that was not based on the Word of God, based on the promises. And that's so important. When we start making bad confessions, I mean, it opens the door to the enemy. If we can absolutely keep the word there and just the word coming out of our mouth, you may have thoughts coming. The enemy's going to put thoughts in your mind. But if you can keep saying what the word says, God honors that. He honors that. Now, I personally believe that every battle we lose comes from fear and negative words that we let come out of our mouth. And sometimes we're so in a habit of doing that they start coming out before we know it. It's worth whatever it takes to say, okay, Lord, with your help, I'm going to change this bad habit. I'm going to get rid of the negative words. I'm going to get rid of those. And when a negative thought comes, it's your word that I'm going to let come out of my mouth. Now, I have a saying when it comes to my health and my protection. And I always say, Lord, I put all my eggs in one basket, and Lord, you're the basket. I don't have any plan Bs. Okay, verse 2 says, I will say to the Lord, my refuge, my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Okay, I want you to notice there in verse 2 in the New American Standards, it says, and you need to circle it, I will say. That's very important. Mark the word say in your Bible, because we have to verbalize our faith out loud. It's not enough to just think it. You know, we think, oh, Lord, I'm thinking about you all the time. No, it's what you say with your mouth. And the scripture says we have to say it. And I don't know what it is, but there's something about saying this that releases power in the spiritual realm. I want you to notice what begins to happen on the inside when you start saying, Lord, you're my refuge. Lord, you're my fortress. It's in you that I put my total trust. The more we say that out loud, the more confident we become in his protection. You can think it all day long, but that doesn't do that much. So often we're in mental agreement that the Lord's our refuge. And we think, oh yeah, sure, Lord, I believe that. But that's not good enough. Something needs to absolutely ignite in your heart. And when everything's going fine is when you need to practice saying the word so that when something does happen, you're familiar, you're ready, you're speaking it. Okay, now let me ask you this. Have you ever tried to touch enough bases to protect yourself now from all the bad things that could happen? Sometimes we're trying to get enough insurance here, we're trying to do this, and we're trying to do that. It's like trying to keep the whole law, and God knew that we couldn't do it. God has to be the one to whom we run first. And he's the only one now who has an answer for whatever might come. Because we don't know. We don't know what's out there. We're living in a fallen world. But God knows, but we have to put our trust in him. So we dwell in his shelter by faith, based strictly on what he tells us and what he gives us in the word. Now, we have to stay close to him because the open doors of self-will and rebellion, sometimes people are fighting with self-will and rebellion, but they can keep the door open to the enemy, and they can keep us out of our secret place. So it's worth whatever it takes to get rid of that self-will, to get rid of that rebellion, and say, Lord, you're my everything. Now, our part of the covenant is expressed in verses 1 and 2, because as we allow him now to be the Lord of our lives, as we allow him to be the promises that we grab hold of, his power is released, and it brings about all the promises in verse 3 through 16. Now, our part's in verse 1 and 2. And you might as well not even look at the 3 through 16 until you get verses 1 and 2 down. But once you get that down, then he is excited then to start showing you answers from 3 through 16. Okay, I want you to look at God's part. In the first part of verse 3, it says, for it is he, God, who delivers you from the snare of the trapper. Okay, now as hard as we may try, we're never going to be able to protect ourselves from the snare of the trapper. It's God who will deliver us when we enter into this covenant and when we put our faith in him. Now the Bible tells us deliverance by man is in vain. The snare of the trapper is it's a graphic way now of talking about the enemy. Anytime you see that in the word, it's talking about Satan. Have you ever seen a movie maybe where there's a fur trapper who goes deep into the mountains and it's in the cold, cold climate, and he baits these big steel traps, covers them over with leaves, and he waits for some unsuspecting animal to step into his traps? I've seen movies like that. Those traps are not there by happen chance. That trapper took great care to place them in very strategic locations so that he could catch his animal. Well, that's a picture of exactly what the enemy does to us. We can see that in the natural realm. But the enemy does that, and that's why he's called the trapper, because he sets those traps. Those traps that are set for us, they're not there by accident. When you have something coming against you, you may think, oh, that was unfortunate. No, it wasn't unfortunate. It was a lot more than that. It was a trap set by the enemy. And those traps are custom made, and they're baited specifically for each one of us because the enemy knows just exactly which thought to put in your mind. He knows just exactly which fear to hit you with. And he puts it in there because he knows what will most likely have the best chance of hooking you. But God says, I'll show you where those traps are hiding if you'll just trust me. God wants you to get into a love walk, a relationship with him where you talk about these things to him. And you tell him how much you appreciate and that you want him to start showing you what might be coming up so you're prepared. Okay, now when American Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, this was on 9/11, Lieutenant Colonel Brian Birdwell, some of you may have read his story, he was standing about 15 feet away from the point of contact. Now, second and third degree burns were inflicted over 70% of his body. And in his own words, he said, fire exploded. And he said, an intense force blasted him. He said, it knocked him completely across the room and ripped off his glasses. Well, after the fire exploded, he said the ceiling panels and the light fixtures all came crashing down. And suddenly he realized, he said, I was on fire. And he said that's when he really panicked. Now, the heat was so intense that the polyester pants of his uniform literally belted into his legs. But he couldn't even think of anything to do. And there was no way to put out the flames. But suddenly he said he felt something that started to trickle past his eye and down his face. And he said he realized it wasn't blood because it was cold. And he said suddenly he realized that water, some of the big water faucets were coming down. And he said it was landing right on top of him. And he said, oh, he couldn't believe it. But all of a sudden, that sprinkler system, it said, as it doused the fire, it started giving him the hope that he needed because he had given up hope. Well, with that touch of water, things changed. And like I say, hope began to come just pouring onto him. Well, another lieutenant colonel, who was a real good friend, suddenly came through the locked door. He was looking for an escape. He couldn't find a way out. But Brian said, I was so disfigured that this friend of mine didn't even recognize me. He didn't know who I was. Brian said the pain was unbearable. He said shreds of skin were literally falling off his fingers, and his arms were burned clear up to the armpits. He said all of a sudden, he had not met her before, but someone who worked there, a Natalie Ogletree, was looking for a way out. She was panicked. She was trying to get out of the building. And suddenly she saw him, and he said she stopped, and she said, I need to pray for you. Would that be okay? Now, only 3 weeks before, Natalie's mother had told her about Psalm 91. She hadn't known about it before then. Now, in her haste, in running, trying to get out of the Pentagon, she said that she just thought, okay, I need my Bible, and she grabbed up her Bible. And since she had only been told about Psalm 91, had only been reading it for about 3 weeks, she didn't have it memorized. So she said she knew that it was a miracle of God for this man that she was going to be praying for. She said she knew that it was a miracle that God had told her to get the Bible. For over 30 minutes, she said she spoke Psalm 91 over him. She said she said it over and over. She said she knew she did it at least 7 times or more. And she told him, you're going to be okay, and then she left. But she ran into him right outside the building, and he wasn't looking good, so she prayed again for the power of God to come on him. Well, finally, they found a way to get him to the hospital, and President and Mrs. Bush were there waiting for him. Now, for 2 months, she said she searched and searched to try to find him, to try to get information to see if he had made it. And she had her Bible study. She said every time they started the Bible study, she'd say, okay, we've got to pray for Colonel Birdwell first. Finally, in December, she heard the news that Birdwell had survived. Now, Brian said, I didn't feel like he said, I didn't think there was anything that could make me feel worse than what I'd already felt. He said, I'd gone through so much. But he said, I was wrong. He had found out that his 2 co-workers had not survived the impact. And suddenly, he was hit with the fact that these 2 people that he had grown to love, but he had never asked them if they knew Jesus. And so he said he didn't know where they went. They died, and he had no idea. So he said a trip to the bathroom had saved his life, but his regret was so deep that he vowed that he would never miss another opportunity to tell the people that he was around about Jesus. And he said, I do that constantly. He was trapped, but through that series of remarkable events, God had delivered him from the snare of the trapper. Okay, the last part of verse 3, it is he who delivers you from the deadly pestilence. Now, I always thought that a pestilence was something that attacked crops. That's what I thought it was. But after doing a word study on this word pestilence, I found, to my surprise, that a pestilence attacks people, not crops. Now, the word pestilence is any fatal epidemic now that hits the masses of people. It's any deadly disease that attaches itself to somebody's body with the intent to destroy. But God says, I will deliver you from that deadly pestilence that comes to destroy. But do we as Christians even stop to consider what this is telling us? You know, we read that, but do we just read right past it and don't realize that God means this literally? That he's saying, I will deliver you from the deadly pestilence, the deadly diseases. And we have to come to a place where we have the courage and we say, Lord, I choose to believe this. This is a covenant that you've given to me. And then let me ask you this. Is it possible for this covenant to be true and yet some people, Christians, still miss out on the promises? We're going to find out that only those who believe God and only those who continue to hang on fast to his promises, those are the ones who are going to receive the promises. Now, it doesn't matter how hard the attack is. Those are the ones who will finally see the promise if they'll just hang on tight, if they'll believe God and not let the enemy steal it. Okay, the first part of verse 4 says, I will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may seek refuge. Now, the Lord gave me a very vivid picture of what it means to seek refuge under his wings. My husband and I lived out in the country, and one spring our old mama hen hatched a whole brood of baby chicks. And one afternoon, it was so much fun. I was watching these little chicks, and they were all over the yard. They were scattered, and I suddenly saw the shadow of a hawk overhead. And boy, I tell you what, my heart just sank because those babies were scattered everywhere. And I thought, there is no way for that old mama to be able to get to those hens, get to those babies. There's just no way. Then I noticed something very unique that taught me a lesson that I don't think I'll ever forget. That old mama hen, she didn't run to those chicks and try to jump on top of them and cover them. She didn't do that. Instead, what she did, she squatted down and she spread out her wings and she just began to cluck. And those babies from every direction, they came running to her to get under those outstretched wings. And then when the last one got under, she pulled those wings down tightly and those babies were safe under her. So to get to those babies now, the hawk would have had to have gone through the mother. And every time I think about those baby chickens running to their mom, I realize that it's under God's wings now that we may seek protection. Don't forget that. God is spreading out his wings, and it's under his wings. But he doesn't run here trying to cover us. He doesn't do that. He tells us about it, and then he expects us to run to him. And when we run to him, he says, I've made the protection available. And when we do that in faith, the enemy would have to go through God to get to us. The first time that I felt like God said that to me, I was so excited I couldn't contain myself. What a powerful promise. Okay, verse 4, the last part of verse 4, God's faithfulness is our shield. It's God's faithfulness. Okay, this next story really got attention in the mainstream media, probably because of what didn't happen. But George and Donna Moore were accustomed to spending the first part of their morning alone with God. And when they both started hearing God say, start praying Psalm 91 every day, they said, oh, something's fixing to happen. So the couple began praying that, and she said she even got to the place where she started putting Psalm 91 under her pillow at night, slept on it. Well, one day, God told George, you need to pray for Jamie's safety. Now, Jamie was their son, and he was in charge of security on the naval base at Corpus Christi, Texas. He was in charge of the whole base. Well, this base seemed to have been safe compared to the dangerous assignments that Jamie had been in the riverines in the Middle East. But George obeyed, and he started faithfully praying Psalm 91. Now, the back gate was open to the base, allowing all the civilians to come in every day. And 2 sailors were stationed at the security check. And as they opened the gates that morning, the outside lane had a rodent stuck in it, and they couldn't get it to open. So that funneled everybody down to just the one lane. Well, there was a young man in a car. He approached the base, and his Arabic music, they said, was blaring so loud you could have heard it blocks away. Well, when it was his turn to enter, he approached the security gate, pulled out a pistol, and shot at the guard. Well, he was close enough to check his ID, so you can imagine how close. Evidently, he must have been nervous when he shot 3 times and only hit her once. But the bullet hit her vest. It was protected by a bulletproof vest, but the impact knocked her to the ground. The other 2 bullets had missed her, and she screamed for help over the radio, still managed to activate the barrier switch. And the shooter, he sped to try to get out of the gate, but it closed on him. The gates closed on him before he could get out. So the timing was perfect. The arm of the barricade was shut on his vehicle, prevented him from going forward or backward. Well, Jamie immediately headed to the scene. The radio call had been unclear, but something was definitely going on, and so he was rushing to get there. Now, as Jamie approached, he could see a laser pointed right at him, and the guy was actively shooting and directly at him. But he was protected. The bullets missed him. The shots were hitting his vehicle, and the other 2 men, he finally got to them. Now, they only had pistols to engage the shooter, while the shooter was using high-powered rifle. Now, the gun was close, too close, and they said that they could literally feel the bullets whizzing by their head. And, of course, later they truly believed that it was because that father and mother were quoting Psalm 91 so faithfully. But Jamie and the other 2 were forced to wait on backup because they only had a rifle, and this other guy had all kinds of equipment. Now, shots were being heard, and they kept saying, he's reloading, he's reloading. But as the shooting continued, now finally they saw the gunman hit the ground, and when they did, they moved in. Now, they didn't realize that they thought he was just a disgruntled person that was on the base until they put the cuffs on him, and they realized that when they got a good look at him, they realized that he was wearing a militant face covering, and it started coming together. They remembered the Arabic music that he was blaring in the car. They saw all the ammunition that he was carrying and the bulletproof vest that he had on. And then it clicked. They had a terrorist on base. And usually when a terrorist is on base, someone's going to get killed. Something bad's going to happen. And he was armed with all kinds of ammunition, all kinds of semi-automatic shotguns and so forth. And he intended to kill many, many that day. Now, the police cars that were parked further down the street, they had bulletproofs that had gone all the way through the car. And the police car that Jamie and the other 2 were crouching behind, they were much closer. Literally, they were right there on the scene. And it, too, was the car was shot up, but the weapons that the gunman was using, none of the bullets went through. None of them were hit. Now, the gunman's aim was downward, and because he's stuck in the barricade, and each time he fired, the bullets would hit the top of the barricade, preventing him from getting a direct hit. And the gunman had shown up with enough ammunition that they said he could have done so much damage, and yet he was not able to kill one person. He wounded one person, but the medical examination she had afterwards showed that she was just bruised. She was back at work that afternoon. So Psalm 91 now stopped the gunman, and in every way possible, and even jammed now one of the incoming gates, funneling everything down to one lane which protected them. Now, most shootouts last just over a minute, they said. But this one lasted 7 long minutes, and they said they felt those 7 long minutes. Now, George and Donna thanked God for his protection over their family and also over the people in the base, and for having them preventively start praying Psalm 91. They said they were so thankful that God had told them to do that they started doing it every day. Truly, it was a shield. Now, it's not just our faith, but it's our faith in God's faithfulness. And when we have faith in these promises, when we have faith in God's faithfulness to do what he promises, it literally becomes a shield, and we can become untouchable to the enemy. Okay, the next 2 verses 5 and 6, you need to mark these in your Bible because they contain extraordinary promises. These 2 verses cover every evil known to man. You need to mark that down. It's divided in 4 categories, and every evil known to man will fit under one of those 4 categories. Now, verse 5, the first part of verse 5 says, you'll not be afraid of the terror by night. This includes all the evils now that come through what another person can do to harm you. Kidnapping, robbery, rape, murder, terrorism, wars. Remember that verse 2 tells us, I will say, the Lord is my refuge and my fortress. Keep remembering, it has to be vocal. It's heart and mouth, believing it with our heart and confessing it with our mouth. Now, most everyone has used a physical weapon at some point in time, even if it's just a kitchen butcher knife. I think everybody's had something in their hands. Okay, our physical weapons are operated with what part of our body? They're operated with our hand. All physical weapons, you use your hand to operate it. We don't operate physical weapons with our big toe or our foot or our ear. We operate them with our hand. Okay, now I want you to hear me because this next statement is important. What part of your body operates spiritual weapons? You must remember this. The part of your body that operates spiritual weapons is your mouth. It's always with your mouth. It's with your words. The blood is applied by saying it in faith. So it's heart and mouth. Romans 10, 9 and 10 says that you believe it in your heart and you confess it with your mouth, and it brings the results. You always operate your spiritual weapons with your mouth. Put that down in your notes because you must remember that. Our daughter had a friend, Julie, living in an apartment in Fort Worth. She was getting ready for church one Sunday morning when someone knocked on the door. Well, she just thought it was one of her friends, so she ran and opened the door, and a man pushed his way in to sexually assault her. So she said, immediately taking authority in Jesus' name. I'm sure these kinds of things have happened to a lot of people, and they don't have the protection because they haven't learned to use their spiritual authority. But Julie had learned, and in the natural, there was no way for a young girl to escape from a grown man who was already in her house. But she was so confident in her authority that she never gave up. She never quit confessing the promises. And she was one who truly knew her authority. It took 45 minutes of spiritual battle. He would come at her time after time, but when she just kept quoting the word, just kept that word coming out, she said he would just kind of become immobile, kind of shake his head like he'd lost his focus. And finally, she was able to escape out the door. Now, after he was caught, she found that he had sexually assaulted numerous young women, and that they found out she was the only one who had ever been able to escape without harm. God's word works, but we have to put it to work. We have to learn what to do and put it to work. So number one, we don't have to fear the terror now of what another person can do to harm us. God has given us that promise for terror. And then the last part of verse 5 gives us the second one. You'll not be afraid of the arrows that fly by day. So the second category now is the arrow. Now, arrows, those are something that pierces and wounds spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally. Those are arrows that are aimed at us, at our mind. And those arrows are sent to destroy you. Arrows are deliberately sent by the enemy. They're meticulously aimed at just exactly the spot that'll cause us the most damage. Sometimes it causes physical damage. Sometimes it's putting thoughts in our mind that cause damage. But they're targeted toward the area in which we have not yet had our mind renewed by the Word of God. And so the enemy sends those thoughts, and if they haven't had their mind renewed, they take those evil thoughts in. Now, the arrow could be circumstances aimed at an area where we're still maybe losing our temper, or maybe it's an arrow that it's aimed at where we're still easily offended, or maybe it's an area where we're still in rebellion or we're in fear. Very seldom does Satan attack us in an area where we're strong. He attacks us where we're still struggling, where we haven't put the word to work. And that's why we have to run to God. And when we do battle now with our spiritual weapons, when we have those promises coming out of our mouth, you need to say your promises every day during the day. Say those promises to keep them alive and well on the inside of you. And the Bible tells us when those promises keep coming out of our mouth, the arrows will not be able to approach us. You know, when my granddaughter was 5 years old, she had been in her bedroom when her mother was leaving to go to the grocery store. Well, Jolena had told the three children, stay upstairs and play. Your dad's out in the garage working. Well, she jumped in the car, my granddaughter, and she glanced in the mirror and just started backing. Well, she didn't have one of these backup cameras. She knew the kids were playing upstairs, but she never dreamed that one of them had come downstairs to ride her little bike. Well, suddenly Heath, her husband, came running, screaming toward the car. Now, even though Jolena was looking through her rearview mirror, Peyton was too far below the rear window to be noticed. So by the time that she stopped the van, Peyton had been thrown under the car. Now, the bike was under the car tire. It was demolished. And Peyton was lying under the bike with her head in direct line of the rear tire. And the tire had stopped, they said, inches from her head. And Peyton was pulled out without a scratch. Now, Jolena and her husband, they have prayed Psalm 91 word for word over their children all of their lives. When Jolena got saved and she heard about Psalm 91, she said, that's going to be mine forever. And she's been faithful. And she's always confessed, no terror, no error, no pestilence, no destruction. And this was a miracle with Peyton that no one could deny. Okay, the first part of verse 6 then, you'll not be afraid of the pestilence that stalks in darkness. So this third category of evil God names is pestilence. Now, this is the only evil that God names twice, and I think that's important. Have you ever noticed that when a person says something more than once, it's usually because he really wants you to hear it? When we mothers tell our children something more than once, we're wanting them to hear us. Now, God knew the pestilence, and he knew the fear, the cancer, the heart disease, the diabetes, and so forth, that was going to be running rampant in these end days. And he was trying to get our attention by repeating the promise. Now, it's as though God were saying, well, I said it in verse 3, but I don't know whether you really heard me. To be sure, I'm going to say it again in verse 6. You do not have to be afraid of the deadly pestilence. I thought it was interesting that he did name it twice. Now, our inheritance is not limited to what's being handed down to us genetically from our ancestors, contrary to what the world says. The world says whatever your ancestors have, you can have it. But that's not true. Our inheritance can be what Jesus provides if we'll believe the word and put it to work in our lives. But we have to be willing to do that. That's our part. Now, I had this close friend named Renee. She was diagnosed right before Christmas a number of years ago with lupus, and it was in the very advanced stages. I've never seen anyone push back any harder and declare that lupus could not work in her body. Every time you saw her, I'd go to see her, and she was really in bad shape by sight. And she'd say, lupus can't work in my body. Well, her kidneys and her liver began to shut down, and for a while, it was one bad report after another. I was having a hard time to keep my faith up for her. Now, most people would have given in to the reports and to the pain, but she continued to stand, and it got so much worse, but she just refused to quit, Well, her daughter carried her finally to the doctor, and the doctor told Renee, you're in the last stages of lupus, and you're going to die. He said, I give you about 3 months. He said, you're not going to make it to Christmas. He said, your system is finally just going to go poop, and you'll be gone. Well, I realized he did not have any kind of a good bedside manner. He just spelled it all out, But he pointed to her 18-year-old daughter who had brought her, and he said, she's big enough, she can take care of herself. And he said, but you're going to die, just prepare. Well, sadly, for the next 12 days, the doctors made one mistake after another. They finally realized that, and it increased her suffering terribly. Even her local doctor called and reminded her. He said, you're dying. You need to let me just put you in the hospital. But she went to a different kidney doctor because she said, I'm not going to go back to that hospital where they've made all the mistakes. She refused the medicine. She wouldn't take the medicine because of the side effects. And not one doctor gave her 1 ounce of hope. But she cried out to God, and she said, Lord, I know you're not finished with me, and I'm not through. I still have work to do. And she said, I have a purpose in this life, and I haven't completed my purpose. And all we could think is she's just continually getting worse. But gradually, suddenly we saw strength began to return. She started being able to stand up more. And she stood on the scriptures that 1,000 would fall at her side, 10,000 at her right hand. But she said, it's not going to approach me. And when that her kidneys began to function, the kidney specialist called it a miracle. The blood specialist said 3 times that it was miraculous. All of this is documented. A third doctor, after studying the last test results on the blood, said, I see no lupus working in your body. And she said those were the exact words she'd been confessing. Lord, no lupus can work in my body. And she's seen 20 Christmases since that first bad report. And she is she's a preaching woman. I mean, she preaches the word. I'm telling you, this Psalm 91 works. It's literal. But sometimes we really have to stand. And I don't know many people that have the strength to stand like she stood. And but anyway, she's preaching the word today. Okay, in the last part of verse 6, it says, you will not be afraid of the destruction that lays waste. Now, destruction takes in the evils over which mankind has absolutely no control. Things that the world ignorantly call acts of God. Those are not acts of God. The tornadoes, the floods, the fires, the car wrecks. Jesus died to protect us from those things. Now, so these things are not coming from God. These are results of the evil that's in the world. But one example of it not coming from God is in Mark 4, verse 39. Jesus rebuked the storm and it became perfectly calm, demonstrating that God is not the author of such things. Otherwise, Jesus would never have contradicted his Father by rebuking something that God had sent. He would never have done that. Now, we must not get our New Testament theology out of the Old Testament. Always look to the life of Jesus. That's where you look. Look to Jesus' life. Under the Old Testament, Jesus had not yet come. Always look to him. He's the exact replica of the Father. Did you know that every extreme evil known to man is going to fall under one of those 4 categories? The terror by night, what another person can do to harm you. The arrows, the deadly assignments, the thoughts that are sent by the enemy. The pestilence, those are the deadly diseases. And the destruction, the natural disasters. And it's an amazing thing that God has offered us deliverance from them all. I remember when I first started reading that, I read it and it was so over my head. I couldn't even believe it when I first read it. But then I'd keep reading and I'd say, Lord, you did say that. But we need to ask ourselves, what about the majority of people out there who don't believe? Well, Romans 3:3 says, if some do not believe, will their unbelief nullify the faithfulness of God? And then God goes on to say, may it never be, because God's going to be found true, even though every man's found to be a liar. And then verse 4 goes on to say, but you will be justified by what you believe and what you say with your mouth. Notice it's not just believing, but it's saying it with your mouth. Then in verse 7, God himself says, 1,000 will fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand. That's literal. And that's why God's warning us that 1,000 will fall, 10,000. And many times it's good people who fall. But realize this, so that it doesn't throw you. It's our choice. Are we going to believe the word? God says, run to my shelter in faith, and it will not approach you. So it's not just because we're a Christian. It's whether we take the word and really put the word to work. If you can find where God has offered it, you can have it, if you determined to hang on to the word. Faith is not a tool now to manipulate God into giving you something that you want. Faith is simply the means by which we accept what God has already made available and put in the word. Late one night, we turned on our radio just as they were announcing that a tornado was on the ground right in the area where we live. Now, we could see the React Club vehicle. He was parked on the road right below the hill, and they were watching the funnel cloud that looked like it was headed straight for our house. Well, Jack quickly ordered our family to get outside with their Bibles, and in our pajamas, we started circling the house, quoting Psalm 91 and taking authority over the storm. Well, the sky was a real strange color, and there was not a night creature making a sound, when suddenly, all of a sudden, the silence turned into a roar with torrents of rain coming down what seemed like buckets full. Well, right before that had happened, Jack had gotten a piece, and he said, it's okay, we can go back in the house now. And when we went back in the house, we got there just in time to hear the on-location reporter call the radio announcer, and he was exclaiming over the air. He was almost shouting. He said, this is nothing short of a miracle, and he used the word miracle. That funnel cloud south of the country club has suddenly lifted up, and it has vanished into the clouds. God's promises are true. I need to tell the end of that story because it's funny. Angie was in her first year at college, and the next morning when she got to class, the professor was leaning up against his desk, and he was asking the students, what were you doing during the storm last night? And a couple of them had found storm cellars, and a number of them had pulled the mattress off their dorm bed and had it over the top of them in their shower. Well, when he got to Angie, he asked her, what were you doing during the storm? And she said, well, my dad had us outside speaking Psalm 91 directly to the storm. And what was so funny, she said he didn't say a word. He just reached over, picked up his book, and he says, okay, let's all turn to page so-and-so. He wasn't about to touch that subject. Okay, verses 8 through 10, you will only look on with your eyes, see the recompense of the wicked, for you have made the Lord my refuge. You've made him your most high. You've made him your dwelling place. Therefore, no evil will befall, neither will any plague even come near your tent or your dwelling place. Okay, God has just added a new dimension to the covenant, and he's given us the opportunity to exercise faith, not only for ourselves, but notice, now he's given a new dimension that we can believe for our entire family. In verses 11 and 12, for he will give his angels charge concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will bear you up in their hands, lest you even strike your foot against a stone. Okay, this is one of the most precious, fun promises of God, and he's put it right here in Psalm 91. Now, Taylor Ball called his wife Kelly that the fire coming toward their ranch house was a 50-foot wall of fire, 7 miles wide. Well, she called his mother, and they began to quote Psalm 91. Now, the wind was 58 miles an hour, and they began crying out to God to stop the wind because it was spreading in all directions. Now, she was very concerned about Taylor because he was between the house and the fire. But within less than 5 minutes of her prayer, she said that the wind completely stopped, didn't just slow down, but it got dead still. Taylor said that the fire burned around his house, around his shop and barn. He said it also burned around his hay bales. It left 2 wheat fields, giving his cattle enough grass to eat until the grass grew back. And he said it didn't hurt any of his cattle, didn't hurt his dogs or his horses. It also didn't burn his hunting cabin, in spite of the fact that the fire had burned way out into the water, and it did get his fishing dock. Now, Taylor had taken his truck about 2 miles down the road to save his truck. But when he returned after the fire, it had burned clear over the top of his truck, but he said it didn't even ruin the paint. They all said if there had ever been a day when they understood that God protects, they said it was that day. Now, the fire burned over 1,000 acres and destroyed miles and miles of fencing, but it harmed nothing of Taylor's that was not easily replaced. But no one could have predicted the burn pattern. But every one of these stories came from people quoting and confessing and standing on their Psalm 91. Verse 13, you will tread upon the lion, the cobra, the young lion, and the serpent you will trample down. Now, Nikki McCurtain was a teacher in Moore, Oklahoma. In 2013, when a picture suddenly appeared in her mind's eye, she said it looked like a war zone, and she was walking through the debris. Now, when the mental picture flashed through her mind a second time, she realized that a disaster was coming. Well, the next school day, sirens began to go off, and several tornadoes had touched down. She said her husband was very concerned. He kept calling. She said the noise from the approaching storm was louder than any train that she had ever heard. And since so many of the kids had been picked up, they were able to squeeze the rest of them. They took them out of the hallway and put them into the restroom. And she said as the tornado sirens screeched, children came out from under the sinks and started stacking like cardboard in the stalls. Nikki's husband called. He was horrified as he watched that tornado. And she looked through the doorway, and she watched the tornado headed straight for them. And literally, it took the whole top off and brought the walls down in the building. Now, she had been praying Psalm 91, verse 4, and she said, you will cover us with your feathers. And suddenly, she said she felt that hand pressed to her back, and she knew that was God. The tornado was deafening, but she heard the Lord say, Nikki, you're going to be okay. Suddenly, children were screaming and walls crashed and their roof completely lifted away. She said that pipes broke and cement blocks flew over like twigs. Sorry, got to stop. My time's up. But anyway, I just had a little bit more. But I just wanted you to know Psalm 91 works. Psalm 91 works. Take that Psalm 91. Start confessing it. And I'm not saying that the enemy won't challenge it, because he will. But just know that God's word is true. And come to a place where you say, Lord, I'm not going to turn it loose. This is your word, and I'm going to believe you.
Holy Spirit calls my name. Chains of fear and shame now break. Freedom song, a burning flame. In our hearts it stays awake. Every step with courage bold. Stories of the truth we're told. In the light our souls behold. Strength and love we won't fold. Where the Spirit lives, there's freedom in the presence. There is peace, freedom rings in every season. In our hearts, it will not cease. Light the fire, never fade. Healing comes in light arrayed. In His love we are remade. With the Spirit, fears allayed. Where the Spirit lives, there's freedom in the presence. There is peace, freedom rings in every season. In our hearts, it will not cease. Lift your voice, let it soar. Freedom knocks on every door. Light and love forevermore. In our hearts, it makes us roar. Where the Spirit lives, there's freedom in the presence. There is peace, freedom rings in every season. In our hearts, it will not cease.